I guess my dad figured that this sort of thing was just another lucky escape and a costly experience, hopefully teaching another lesson. Next day we found the horse in a shattered harness south of Pleasant View in the meadows near Harrisville. When the disastrous influenza of 1918 struck, spreading throughout the entire country, and I suppose other countries in the world, the schools were dismissed for many weeks during this tragic winter, supposedly to lessen the spread of contagion. And people by the thousands were stricken. The dead were counted in tens of thousands. So the young people in our town felt it best to invigorate themselves, living most of the time outdoors, away from the sick in the homes. This we surely did, and both day and into the late evenings we were outside in the snow, sleigh riding, playing games, and doing all kinds of fun things in the winter. The temperature was cold and not too much snow, but there was excellent ice skating everywhere that winter. The ponds near and west of the Utah Hot Springs were provided excellent skating. In fact, we skated along the roadsides. Most everywhere it was so cold that there was a sheet of ice or icy snow on which we could skate. And skating was real popular in those times, and most everyone had a pair of skates. We'd build bonfires on the thick ice, and at night time we'd skate around those fires. We had races, we cut capers, and then we'd eat around the fires. I think chili was served, and we took our own food in many cases, and in general we all had great fun, which we'll always remember. Near the end, or soon after the World War I, school was dismissed one day in the springtime, and all of the school students walked in a group to a level spot west of the Utah Hot Springs that was prepared by my father, the Pleasant View Road supervisor, for the landing of the first airplanes to come into Utah. This was a real event, and we had anticipated this previously for some time. The airplanes were things that we had heard about. Few, if any, of the students had ever had any idea of how they could even fly. And none of us had ever seen one. There was no airports, nor even any airstrips or runways. And the main reason they were coming to Utah Hot Springs area was because of the comparatively level salt, I guess they're really alkaline land surfaces. There's a lot of level land west of the Utah Hot Springs then. We scanned the skies for some time, searching for the first glimpse of these two man-made birds. And by this time, many others were arriving, adults, families, Ogden officials, and military personnel. And someone said, oh, there they come. And far off in the southwesterly direction over the lake, we could see two small specks in the sky. They were getting bigger, coming closer. And to my real surprise, their wings were not flapping. I never knew that any bird could fly without its wings moving. And these two biplanes surely thrilled everybody as they sat down on the improvised dirt runway. And then the pilots jumped out with big smiles on their faces. Some of us were asked to stay with those planes and watch them as the pilots were taken to Ogden for recognition and praise and welcome and that sort of thing in Ogden, and to have a good banquet in their behalf and in their honor. And I was one of those boys that welcomed this opportunity to stay, although I was one of the smaller boys, and stay near those new man-made birds. This was a real special experience for not only me, but many others. The greatest lessons that I ever learned in my life, especially when I was a boy and in my growing up years, came from experiences on the farm. We had to work hard, and that was one of the great lessons that I learned, is to work. We knew the value of money because it was very difficult to get any. And we knew that if we didn't work, we couldn't eat. And so these were just a few of the many experiences that we learned in trying to be efficient in order to do the things that had to be done so that we might be able to carry on and make a living and pay our way. I remember that water was very scarce, and as I've mentioned elsewhere, I think, that my grandfather and my father were men who did a great deal towards not only conserving water, but finding new sources. When I was young, I remember so well that we had to patrol the streams of water that came from the mountainside and the hillside. Alder Creek, the larger stream, larger than Little Missouri, had its beginnings at the foot or base of Ben Lomond. And there was an open ditch that came across the fields, down through the hollows, and down to our place. And we had to patrol that ditch in order to keep the leaves out of it and keep the rats from digging holes, and for anything else that might happen to delay that water. We'd clean out the ditch so it could travel faster. We always figured that there's only part of the water that ever did arrive because the other would soak into the ground, and especially during the hot weather. And so we had to use conservative practices. When the water arrived at our place, we had 3 ponds that we put this in sometimes so that it could gather at night, and then we could use it in the daytimes, let the ponds out and have a larger stream and be able to see in the daylight how to efficiently use it. But many times we didn't do that. We'd take the water and put it directly on the orchards or in the rows of corn or tomatoes or cantaloupes and melons. And in the orchard we would take the water down the rows and then build a reservoir around the tree in order to capture a good many gallons of water. And we'd continue so that all the trees had a reservoir around them. And when these were filled, that's about all the water that we could afford for that tree for that particular turn. These were real hard times, especially when water was scarce and when the winters hadn't been very good. The horses had to work hard on the farm too. We all did, and they had to bear a great share of the heavier burdens. 3 of the horses that I remember so well were Maud, Dan, and Dick. To find them in the mornings, or to harness them up in the mornings and get them ready, and to prepare them for their work in the daytime was sort of a chore to start with. And then we would hitch them up to the implements that we had, especially the spring tooths, in order to cultivate the orchards. I used to get real unhappy with these horses sometimes when they would get too close to the limbs, and the hames that held the harness to the collar would sometimes grab a hold or catch on to the limbs of the trees and shake off the fruit. But these horses had to work, and how well I remember them getting so hot in the summer, in the hot days, that they would lather all over, sweat and lather. And then sometimes they would get sores on their shoulders underneath their collars. And that presented a real problem, because once the sores came, you could seldom ever get them healed unless you gave them a long rest. And then these horses, sometimes their shoulders would quiver. They'd be so tired, and their muscles would be so spent, I suppose. And I used to wonder why they would stand up all night and eat all night rather than lay down. And that was quite true, that horses don't lay down very often. And when they were working hard and wanted to eat, they'd seldom lay down at night. As they'd pull the spring tooth, we usually used 2 horses. It would gather up a certain amount of trash, and then we'd have to pull it out to the ends of the orchard and dump it. And there were some levers on the spring tooth that would control the depth and certainly the pitch of the teeth. And we'd have to trip those, move the levers so that we could get the trash out, and often we'd have to lift on the spring tooth, lift it up off the ground and push the trash out with our feet. This was certainly pioneering as compared with what is done in recent years. We had to do lots and lots of walking, and you'd get real tired and dusty. I remember one time that Dan got a leg infection. I don't remember how. I think it was from barbed wire, which is a treacherous thing to tangle with because it's so difficult to heal, and it always scars. And this seemed to be the worst enemy of animals, is barbed wire. We were uncertain to his future because his leg was full of infection. And so my father gave me the job of taking a bucket of water and putting a certain amount of blue vitriol. I think this is copper sulfate, really, but blue vitriol we called it, and put it in the bucket, and then lift his foot and put his foot in the bucket so that he could, so that this could do something for this infection. I remember when I did this that the maggots, the worms, would fall out of his leg, and that always bothered me to think that the worms were eating him. But you know, they cleaned out that proud flesh, that decaying flesh, and cleaned it out, and he got better. And of course that was very good news for our family. All of our horses were good pullers. My father was good at teaching them to be so. He wouldn't have a balky horse around because he always said that they were the ones that could break more harnesses and do nothing than any other kind of an arrangement. He loved a good steady horse, and a good steady horse didn't usually break harnesses. Sometimes you'd have one horse that was stronger than another, and so you'd put the stay chain, which was called a short chain, that would go from the single tree that the stronger horse would be pulling from, and hook it back to the wagon, and then give him a chance to pull more, so that they weren't on an equal, what they called a double tree in pulling. I suppose the horse that we probably loved the most, and certainly remember the best, was Old Dick. He was the smaller of the 3 horses that I've mentioned, but he was a terrific puller for his weight. He was a black, what they call hog-backed, which is a sloping back on his rump. Middleweight horse, and he had a white strip down his nose. He was just medium weight, but he had some terrific qualities. The Utah Power and Light had a truck that was stuck in the mud in the field at one time. And we put him on that truck, and he pulled and stayed with it and leaned and never gave up, and finally got the truck out. And those men praised that horse for years, because I'd never seen anything quite like it. Usually a horse pulling by himself would lunge and break tugs and probably do nothing. But this little horse was a very dependable one. In well digging, I think I've mentioned elsewhere that he would pull up the buckets after he's trained, or just shown really what to do. He would pull up the buckets of mud and water, and we'd put a log or something out to give him the distance to go, and when he got to that, he'd stop and back up, and we just give him signals, and he never had a rider. And he certainly could be depended upon from a standpoint of steadiness and dependability. And a sad experience one day happened. He disappeared. This had never happened before. And we looked and inquired everywhere through this town of Pleasant View and other towns. No one knew anything about him. We couldn't understand it. And about 10 days later, I was near the barn and heard a sound. And it wasn't rather some familiar sound, but I knew it was an animal. And upon looking around, I was the one that found Dick. And he'd gotten in the granary. He'd filled up on grain and was foundered. And over that period, he'd become really dehydrated, and we certainly never expected him in there. He'd entered by pushing open an unlocked door, and the door had closed behind him, and he made no sounds. He was quite happy, I'm sure, to start with, having all the grain he wanted to eat, which is really suicide for any animal, certainly a horse, to get more than he should at one time. This was a happy and yet sad reunion to find our old Dick. We were surely glad to see him, and I'm sure he was to see us. He hadn't had a drink for so long. He was at last found, but was barely alive. Very sick animal. All of us were sad just to look at him. We cared for him, did everything we could, but in a few days later, he died. He was best remembered among all our many horses we had owned over the years. Steady puller, gentle, you could trust him, exceptionally dependable, just a real good horse. Really a historical character in our family. I'm sure that my brothers and I and my dad would always remember old Dick. When we sprayed trees, our sprayers were, in those days, when I was a boy, not too adequate, and certainly far from the quality of sprayers that we now have. One thing I well remember, we did have bugs, we had aphids, we had mites, and we had codling moth, we had twig borer. Those were all pests. And we used to spray insecticides. Arsenic and lead was probably the favorite. And this was a rather sure thing for codling moth and twig borer. But for aphids, some other things, it wasn't effective. I remember that my dad used to say, if we can't get them with arsenic and lead, we'll try nicotine sulfate. Now, nicotine sulfate is nothing more than just plain concentrated tobacco juice. And it was a very impressive thing to me that in this little tiny bottle, with just a matter of a few ounces in it, that this nicotine sulfate was so deadly and so strong that my dad always used to hide it so that no one could get it and make a mistake by being poisoned. And when we'd get to the point that we had to use nicotine sulfate, he'd put a few drops or a spoonful or two in a big tank of water, and we could surely get the aphids and kill all the pesticides, the pests. And that impressed me as to the horrible strength of nicotine. In the harvesting, we used to ship lots of peaches out in boxcars. And for many years we shipped out mixed cars where we had peaches, melons, cantaloupes, tomatoes. They all matured about the same time. And there's a man in Montpelier, Idaho that took much of our fruit. We'd load these on cars, boxcars, refrigerated cars, and send them to C.N. Lillienquist in Montpelier, Idaho. And he bought lots of fruit from us. Now, in recent years, trucks could do this same job and do it so much faster and cheaper and quicker that the boxcars wouldn't be used and haven't been used on a situation like that. But in those days, to go to Montpelier, Idaho, that seemed to be the best way to go. And so in the orchard, as we harvested, we had what we called a drag. It was two runners, two logs with a cable tied to these two logs with boards nailed across them. And the horse would pull this drag through the orchard and around the different places where there was fruit that was picked. And we'd pull this out to the edge of the orchard where we could put the fruit on a hay rack and then transport it to the railroad at the Utah Hot Springs. My job was to lid the peaches and drag them out. And as we hauled them on the hay racks, we would take mixed loads of fruit, the ones I've mentioned. We would load them, and this happened after the day was done, you might say, and the loading took place in the late afternoon and into the night. And at the Utah Hot Springs, it used to be part of the style and part of the plan, and part of the program and schedule for several of us to be there loading cars with flashlights, with lanterns, trying to get them ready so that the railroad engine could pick them up in the night. And I remember so many times that we would, when the railroad switching engine would come, we would ask the brakeman if we could ride in while they switch on the cars, box cars, while they switched them. They'd usually give us permission, and we'd hang onto the sides of the cars, have the fun of going for a ride in the switching process. Another thing we used to do when no one was around and no other activity, and some of us smaller boys were waiting for something to happen or waiting for another load of fruit to come, something like that, we would get up on top of the boxcars and run from one to another, jump from one to another, and run along the platforms that are erected on top of the boxcars, the runways. And we had a lot of fun doing that and climbing down over the boxcars. And sometimes when they needed to move a car because it was placed in the wrong place and the doors were next to a telephone pole or something like that, we would use big pries. And some of us would get up on top of the boxcar and release the brakes. And with these big mammoth pries, we could move the boxcar so it would be at a more suitable place. We tried to pull boxcars with a horse or horses, or even with the old trucks that we used to have. And you just couldn't budge one of those old boxcars, but prying under the wheels, this big pry could usually move them a short distance. When I was a boy, it seemed like that the winters were accompanied with much snow. We always seemed to have lots of snow. And the summers always seemed to be real hot. I don't know whether the seasons have changed or whether it was just my impressions when I was younger. But I remember when the snow came, at one time I decided to make a snowplow. We had only the implements and the tools in those days that we provided for ourselves, at least for the most part. And so I took some 12-inch boards, 2x12s, and put them together in a wedge shape and braced them, put a chain on the front and a platform on the top of it so that I could stand on it, and put some weights on there, and then I would drive the horse down the roads to make a path, which was quite effective, but it seemed like it was never straight, very crooked. And this served as a means of plowing us out when the snow was deep. Much of the time we traveled by horseback, when we wanted to go places through the deep snow. That seemed to be a very effective thing to do. I remember when I was quite a young boy that I wanted to make a bridge over to my grandmother's place to the east. And from our old home to grandmother's was a deep hollow, and a stream of water traveled down the hollow. And it seemed like that I just wanted to make a bridge, and so I took some of my dad's best lumber and cut it up into pieces and made me a bridge. I know my dad was real unhappy with that, but it seemed like a real accomplishment for me. During the hay time, I was, when a young boy, asked or assigned to cut the hay and to do the raking. We had a mowing machine, one of the older types, and we cut through the tall hay. I remember many times that we cut through the nests of pheasants and sometimes cut their legs off. And when we did that, we would kill the pheasant and take it